Okay, everybody, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and warmest welcome to today's Australasian Dark Sky Alliance webinar about the neuroscience of light pollution with our very special guest, Dr. Maya Babu. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land where I'm joining you from today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land wherever you're joining from today and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm Associate Professor Jen Martin. I'm the leader of the Science Communication Teaching Program at the University of Melbourne and also a proud member of the ADSA board. And one of the things that I've been most excited about in my work with ADSA is the ADSA Youth Ambassador Program, which Marnie Og and I established last year. And I'm sure many of you know Marnie. So just before I introduce our guest speaker to you, I'd like to introduce you to one of our inaugural youth ambassadors, Gabrielle Allegrotto. Hi, Gabby, are you there? Yes, there's Gabby. Because Gabby is going to be facilitating the Q&A session at the end of today's talk. Gabby is currently working on her PhD at the University of Tasmania, studying the environmental and societal impacts of light pollution. So please put your questions in the chat box as we go so that Gabby will know exactly what you would like to ask. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce you to our guest speaker, Dr. Maya Babu. We're so privileged to have Dr. Babu with us. Now, she has far too many accolades to her name for me to list them without taking up most of the seminar time we have today, so I won't do that. But suffice it to say that she's excelled while achieving a whole heap of different degrees, a Bachelor of Neuroscience, a BA in Psychology, a medical degree from Harvard Medical School, and an MBA from Harvard Business School. She's a neurosurgeon with extensive experience in many different places working in neurotrauma. She's also a board member of the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke. According to Twitter, she's also a self-confessed health policy junkie, as well as a former Liza Minnelli impersonator. Dr. Babu, I'd really like to ask you more about that. But we are just so grateful for your time today, joining us all the way from the States, where it is yesterday afternoon for those of us in Australia. So please take the stage, Dr. Babu, and thank you again.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the warm welcome and introduction, Dr. Merton. And I also have to thank Marnie as well. She's absolutely wonderful, as you all know. And I've had the wonderful opportunity to get to know her several years ago before the pandemic, and she's just a gem. So very thrilled to have the invitation tonight. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Let's see. So tonight's talk is really meant to focus more on the human aspects of lighting health, light pollution, and the health impacts that have been studied thus far and published in the literature. The technical aspects of lighting have obviously changed considerably over time. And as I'm not a lighting engineer or specialist, I am going to defer that to our lighting colleagues who are more expert than myself. But what I can share with you is what the literature shows in terms of the studies that have been done on light perception, and light pollution. And hopefully open it up to some questions about what we can do to think in the future about the impact of lighting on not only our health, but the environment's health among insects, plants, as well as animals. So to start, I'm just going to briefly cover the anatomy of the eye and just in general terms talk about photoreception, because that's really the mechanism through which the effects of lighting, the adverse effects of lighting from a neuroscience standpoint seem to stem. Talk briefly about LED lighting, which again, I would say is probably much more a subject that many of you are knowledgeable about. But then really try to tie this into circadian rhythms and what we think we understand about how light impacts health. Then talk a little bit about bright screens, some of the data on that, as well as human and environmental issues. So to begin, again, in very general terms, the eye, this is the human eye on the left, light is transmitted through the cornea, through the pupil. The lens is really the structure within the eye, and focused on the back of the eye, the retina. The retina is the key processing region for visual information. Now, on the right aspect of your screen, you can see that the retina itself is a very complex layer. We'll talk about this on another slide. But basically, the retina is not one layer of cells, it's multiple layers of cells. And as you can see, there are amacrine cells, the yellow cells that actually have, I can show this, have arms that reach across other cell bodies. And the idea is that even within the retina, processing of information begins. We think about information and visual processing as really happening a lot in the brain via the optic nerves. But what's interesting about light and light perception is a lot of that processing actually begins in the eye itself and in the back of the eye, the retina. So when light is transmitted, as we can see from our screen here, through the lens, through the pupil, and into the back of the eye, the retina itself is a thin membrane, and within the retina, there's a region that actually has a more direct pathway from the outside world and light to the actual pigmented epithelium, which is the region where most of the processing occurs. You can see that the capillaries, which are the arteries, the small arteries that feed this tissue layer, are actually diminished in this space called the fovea. So this is kind of the critical area of photoreception in the retina. Now, if we're to kind of zoom into that with this schematic on the bottom right side, you can see again, there's tremendous complexity. The retina is not one layer of cells, it's multiple layers of cells that begin to communicate with one another and integrate the information that is perceived. So you can see the retinal ganglion cells, there's amacrine cells that reach across these to start to integrate information. We have photoreceptors, rods, cones that help us with colors, with dark, gray-white perception. And then we start transmitting that information to the deepest layer of tissue, the retinal pigmented epithelium. And from there, the optic nerves actually transmit the information back to the back of the brain, which is the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is the visual processing center, but really it's a higher order processing center because a lot of processing begins in the retina itself. So light perception is really thought to underlie a lot of the concerns we have about LED lighting, artificial lighting, light pollution, because obviously our brains and our eyes have been attuned over generations to capture light and attempt to process light. So we have a lot of built-in systems that we consciously are aware of, but also unconsciously process information that help us differentiate day from night and have a lot of physiologic consequences. So in simple terms, when we talk about LED lighting, light emitting diodes, now there's been movement towards changing street lighting, certainly in the US, I know in other parts of the world, the thought being that this, although the transition was initially to be more expensive with higher installation costs, much has been touted in terms of the reduction of energy consumption with LED lighting compared to conventional high pressure sodium lighting, which again is not universal, but certainly was a concern voiced in several communities and helped spur the transition to LED street lighting. LED conversion was also touted as helping to reduce the carbon footprint, and conversion has been underway in many parts of the United States. Now, the challenge with LED lighting is how the light is perceived and what needs to be produced in order for us to see the light, the white light in particular. LEDs tend to be the dominant form used for tablets, iPads, iPhones, things that are pretty ubiquitous in our society. Coupling of blue LED light with a phosphor has been used to produce the perceived white light source. And the most common type of LED is this white light LED. And the challenge has been, while light obviously has various intensities of emission, blue LED with a peak of emission between 450 and 470 nanometers, you also have a yellow phosphor that's also coupled with it to produce white light. Now, what I've learned and kind of what prompted the initial look at it from a medical standpoint, from the American Medical Association in particular, was that white light LEDs, tended to degrade over time through a mechanism through which there was bleaching of phosphors, so that these light sources actually no longer efficiently absorbed blue light. This seemed to shift the actual color temperature and also over time seemed to produce more emissions related to the blue end of the spectrum. So the concern for how blue light actually influences, because we weren't really talking about the white light that we perceived, this is where that was born. So why the concern with blue light emission in particular? Well, some of the literature had suggested that the blue end of the spectrum actually tended to activate a specific type of nerve in the eye, in the retina in particular, the retinal ganglion cell. If you remember back to the schematic, this was the most superficial layer we saw in the retina, the back of the eye. Photoreceptors in these cells tended to have a sensitivity that seemed to mirror the blue end of the spectrum. They also produced melanopsin, which was a photopigment. So as we began to understand and continue our understanding of the eye and how we process visual information, was found that a major function of the retinal ganglion cells was to detect light and to help take that light perception and synchronize that within our day light cycle, our circadian pacemaker. Now, the circadian rhythm that we hear about is actually mediated by several structures within the brain. We'll talk about the suprachiasmatic nucleus in another slide, but the hypothalamus, which is a very important structure deep in the brain, is an integrative center. It uses information about light, day, night, but it also integrates functions, temperature. We hear about fight or flight response, physiologic responses, feeding, also, having to urinate, etc. So multiple physiologic functions have a processing supervisor in the hypothalamus. And so interestingly, the retinal ganglion cells actually transmit information, which in part is sent to the hypothalamus. Now, these cells in particular also, through that function, mediate other behavioral and biologic physiology. So we also see suppression of melatonin, which is an important hormone that helps with sleep. You can now purchase melatonin to help with helping to induce sleep, but it's naturally produced by the pineal region. The pineal, it's a hormone that's secreted to help regulate sleep-wake cycles. Also, enhancement of alertness and attention, and also whether our pupils are constricted or dilated. These are all functions that help us be more awake during daylight hours, and they also help us be tired when it's appropriate to sleep. So when we talk about melanopic content, in particular, the term is used to describe the amount of visible light detected by these retinal ganglion cells. Now, the retinal ganglion cells aren't the only form of cell in the retina, but they tend to be dominant for controlling non-visual or fine perception light. So it's really a crude light receptor, but a very important receptor as we're beginning to understand. Now, overall activity tends to be an integrated signal, meaning it's not necessarily simple, one cell interprets a piece of visual information and transmits it back via optic nerves to the occipital cortex, that processes information. Instead, we understand that there's multiple proteins, enzymes, and nerves that have to communicate back and forth. So under most lighting conditions, what we're seeing is that non-visual light tends to be dominated by this melanopsin or protein-based photoreception, meaning when the light source is not intense, the body has to be aware and react to potential dangers, to be able to scan the environment, to respond. And so another system almost takes over. It's not the fine processing of visual information that much attention is been devoted towards. It's kind of that understanding of what's happening in the environment that is often mediated at almost a subconscious level. So let's get back to our main topic of interest, which is really blue light. So what's interesting is the spectral characteristics of some of the street lighting that's been of concern is when we're thinking about the emissions and going back to the whole issue with blue light and a phosphor source, what does it mean over time to have more of the emissions that are related to blue light? When we just anecdotally have reviewed information with patients, or patients are increasingly using glasses that help cut down glare from blue light, discomfort voiced, sleep disturbance voiced. There have been papers looking at melatonin suppression, as was mentioned, and also circadian disruption, as we'll talk about in a future slide. So let's talk a little bit more about the human impact in particular. So as we get older, our lens, that outer portion of the eye that helps basically focus and bring in light information from the external world internally, that lens tends to become yellowish with time. What this means is that blue light transmission tends to decrease as we age. One theory has suggested that older individuals in particular may experience sleep problems due to a lack of blue light during the day. Now, what's interesting is there was one paper that I cite here that looked at cataract extraction before and after and found that sleep quality seemed to improve. Now, that's interesting. The cataract, formation is when the lens essentially is clouded and has to be replaced. And so the question is, why during sleep is that structure important if the brain is not actively perceiving the outside world? So certainly those types of reports and studies suggest that there are important functions that are happening even during sleep when we may be perceiving the outside world, or even during the day as our eyes are exposed to light. Now, there is a question. I'm not sure if you want me to. Okay. Yes, we will address that afterwards. So another paper actually reported that in older folks, acute exposure to blue light, but not to other light, in this study, they looked at green light, decreased alertness and actually suppressed sleep and melatonin production compared to younger people. Interesting. But there was another study that seemed to suggest that melatonin was not suppressed. So I would say that overall, there are some papers that seem to suggest that there's melatonin suppression, but there's others that challenge that by not finding any sort of preponderance. So I would say it's still mixed as to the effect of blue light. Now, in thinking about light damage, light-induced damage to the retina can happen through one of several mechanisms. Obviously, mechanical, direct damage to the retina, thermal, if there's a bright enough light that it actually burns cells within the retina, or chemical. It can be caused by enzymatic breakdown, pathology, diseases that actually destroy those cells themselves. These processes lead to normal cell breakdown, which is called reactive, which through one pathway, I should say, involves reactive oxygen species. So we've heard of free radicals. That's associated with cellular death in a very simple way. So the thought is that this oxidative damage can accumulate, these free radicals that happen as a cell dies or as a cell is destroyed can actually build up and form a layer. And this in turn can actually cause further damage. So in, again, very simplistic terms, this lipofusin, which is lipo means fat and fusin often is referring to a specific proteinaceous buildup, can actually be phototoxic to remaining cells. So it almost compounds the effect. Now we normally have some enzymes that help us. So for instance, superoxide dismutase or SOD1 is listed here. And that's seen as more of a protective, a cleaner enzyme that can help address, cellular death. As we get older, we tend to have less enzymatic function in general. So we don't have as many protective, restorative, regenerative mechanisms like these. So any damage that happens as we get older tends to have this compound effect, in other words. So getting back to blue light, a paper here is cited by Cusey et al. That certain cells are actually more sensitive to light-induced damage when exposed to blue LEDs as opposed to green or white. So again, there's something about blue light in particular that seems to be particularly bothersome or concerning, I should say. So interestingly, another paper states that when lutein was administered, retinal photodamage seemed to improve. Now, again, I wouldn't say that this study was conclusive. Lutein is still not considered to be a universal agent. We'll talk about this at the end of the talk, but there's some literature to suggest that it may have a protective function. The amount of blue light may be related to age-related macular degeneration. Again, the cause of AMD, still unclear, but that's been one theory that's been cited. Now, interestingly, there's been some work looking at the actual spectrum of blue light that's emitted and suggests that even within blue light, there are certain wavelengths that are more damaging than others. So it may not be the blue light itself, it may be the end of the spectrum in which the light is being emitted that seems particularly concerning, again, because it seems to trigger one type of cell in our retina. The development of LEDs with a peak emission around 470 to 490 or so may be helpful. Again, this is suggested based on some of the literature that's actually tried to look at specific spectrum, specific wavelengths, excuse me. So thinking broadly about light and the circadian rhythm. So again, very simply, when we think about the circadian rhythm and what it allows us to do, and its more rudimentary form is in many species, helps us understand day versus night. The light is transmitted back to the retina. From the retina, we talked about the processing actually starts. Some of the retina ganglia cells actually provide a lot of initial information. That's transmitted via the optic nerves back to the back of the brain, the occipital lobe. But you can think there's a pathway here that has to traverse essentially the brain. And there's a region here that's marked out, the SCN, the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And what's interesting about that is it lives right above where the optic nerves travel. And it's another important center. So you can see the cells within this nucleus, they tend to actually oscillate. I'm not going to get into too much detail, but there's been some really fascinating research looking at some of the cellular structures, and they seem to have this kind of automatic pacemaker function, and that's where the term has really originated. You know, we think of your heart rate, your heartbeat as very rhythmic, very regular. Well, there are other structures in our body that also seem to be very regular. And so it's kind of understanding what proteins influence that rhythmicity and how that might be altered. So the suprachiasmatic nucleus in particular tends to be one of those centers. And it seems that depending on whether light is being perceived or not, the output varies, the oscillatory output varies. And so that output in turn is actually transmitted to multiple organs. So not only within the brain, the pituitary gland, which controls multiple hormones, the pineal gland, as we discussed, which controls melatonin, which helps with sleep, liver, lung, kidney, many of the internal organs, because you can think about the functions that need to happen when we're awake. We need to be able to move, we need to be motivated, we need to feed, our temperature is higher than when we're sleeping, and also if there's any sort of physiologic needs, those are all attended to when you're awake, not when you're asleep. So the circadian rhythm or cycle really has to communicate with pretty much every function that we have. So in thinking about circadian rhythms and blue light in particular, there have been some studies looking at whether blue light has actually altered the circadian pacemaker system. So this is one study that looked at two groups. And so I'm going to explain it because it's a bit confusing, but I think their point is interesting. So essentially there were two groups. Each group had 90-minute sleep schedules for 1 week. One group was basically designed to advance their circadian phase, whereas another group was meant to delay their circadian phase. So the first group received 2 morning hours of blue light and 3 evening hours of light restriction. The second group received blue light for 3 hours in the evening and light restriction in the morning, so kind of inverted. Now, what was interesting is that irrespective of the fixed sleep schedule, controlling the light-dark exposure shifted the circadian phase. So actually the phase in group 1 advanced 132 minutes, whereas in group 2 it was 59 minutes. So that's interesting because it's not necessarily related to how regulated a person's sleep is. It suggests that there is something to do with the actual light exposure that influences it. And this will become relevant when we talk about night shift in a few slides. So there's been some study of LED versus fluorescent lighting. So this is another paper that looked at two groups, studied two groups, one exposed to blue depleted light. So the idea is, could this be more protective in terms of the circadian pacemaker system, versus group 2, which was exposed to quote unquote standard fluorescent light. So each group had was exposed to equal luminescence for luminance for 8 hours prior to a fixed bedtime. This was only done over 2 days. So what was interesting is melatonin suppression was actually reduced in the group 1 that had blue depleted light. There was no significant difference in total sleep time, interestingly enough, but auditory reaction times were actually slower in group 1, the blue depleted light, than the control group. So there seems to be something in particular about blue depleted light versus what we consider standard light that does at least influence melatonin. Now, the circadian dependency of this system seems to involve mechanisms, and again, this is being studied pretty heavily, but there are two proteins in particular, cyclic AMP and CFOS, and very specific details, but you see that within a cellular sort of, how does a cell control and communicate? We're beginning to understand how those processes kind of move down the line in terms of everything that needs to understand whether it's daytime or nighttime in terms of body function. So I would be remiss if I didn't talk about screens. So there's been some work looking at different types of monitors. Certainly with our smartphones, the bright light, the blue light has been a concern. So this is a paper that looked at two groups, one conventional LED smartphone, the other a suppressed blue light smartphone. Interestingly, they were exposed right before bedtime for 150 minutes. Now, melatonin levels were measured, and there were also some other battery of tests that were performed. But blue light smartphones seem to be associated, interestingly, with decreased sleepiness, but increased error commission on some of the scales that were used. There was also a delay in terms of dim light melatonin onset, again, suggesting suppression. So interestingly, this paper was looking more at function, in terms of error commission on specific tests. And continuous performance tests in particular. And so what's interesting is that it's almost questioning the quality of sleep. It's not saying necessarily that patients or study subjects felt more sleepy during the day after blue light exposure. Instead, there was something about them that made them not on their game. So I think that that's also interesting as well, when we think not only of sleep, but also the quality of sleep, that there's something that blue light may actually be altering that influences this. So getting to night shift workers, because this is where I think a lot of the concern related to cancer risk with light exposure, et cetera, stems. So if we step back and we say, okay, there's something about artificial light that's artificial, that's not normal. And we have adapted over time to brighter and brighter lights, and perhaps spectrums of light that our bodies are not used to and may have deleterious effects. So stepping back, where can we study this the best? Well, we have a group of people who actually have their entire cycles switched. People who work the night shift consistently. Day becomes night, night becomes day. And how do these people adjust? And what can we tell about their adjustments that's positive or negative? So there's been quite a lot of work, mostly observational. So in terms of study value, not the greatest. It's certainly not case controlled and prospective, but a fair amount of data gathered over time from epidemiologic studies involving multiple people, thousands in some studies, trying to see if there's trends, among night shift workers. So some of this epidemiologic data suggests that night shift workers tend to have higher rates of obesity, tend to have more issues with diabetes, basically dysregulated metabolism. Animal studies that have been controlled suggest that there are disruptions with circadian rhythms that seem to be associated with inflammatory markers, not only in the brain, but also in the body. And there have been some theories as to why this inflammatory state may be related, but it could be that, the timing of food intake, as well as some of the just almost subconscious feedback that we get from light and dark, because of the dysregulation leads to changes in metabolism, which can actually just make the body feel stressed. The body almost doesn't know on a rudimentary level what's happening, why you have to be more alert when you should be asleep or feel sleepy. And so that tends to cause this sort of inflammatory kind of disquiet in the body. Now, this is a very kind of simple schematic from one paper, but basically it suggests that, when you switch light and dark, you're excreting hormones. Again, the body's kind of confused, so the hormone levels are going to be altered. Now, this may actually, in some ways, disrupt the circadian pacemaker, leading to sleep disruptions. Now, we're still trying to understand sleep, and sleep is its own topic, which is fascinating because we really don't understand sleep. There's theories for why we sleep. One theory is that it helps us clean out, the markers and metabolites and the things that accumulate that are potentially toxic, and it allows our body to have a cleansing period. That's one theory. Now, one thought is if you don't get adequate sleep or you don't get appropriate sleep, and again, the quality of sleep is a question as well, that you have more inflammatory markers. So here there's some that are listed on the schematic, TNF alpha, et cetera. And the thought is that increased inflammation can lead to tumor production. So we think of, smoking, and we think of mechanisms related to risk factors for breast cancer, excess hormones, for instance, with some cancers that may just be triggering more inflammatory markers. The thought being that this triggers cell growth, which at the end of the day is tumorigenesis. Now, again, this has not been shown, I would say, and there's quite a few studies that are contradictory. I was actually trying to review the literature for breast cancer and night shift workers, and it is all over the map. So I didn't include it in this talk because for every study that suggests there's a correlation, there's another study that has shown that there is no association. So I think that it's still a very nascent and certainly unproven link, but the trends are interesting. And so I think it raises questions on how we can maybe try to make improvements to stem any possible concern going forward. Now, I tried to look for more kind of unique literature that's been published in the last several years. There hasn't been a tremendous amount, but I'm citing two papers here that I thought were interesting. So one actually looked at animal studies in rodent and monkey models related to Parkinson's disease. So Parkinson's is a neurodegenerative disease, very debilitating in terms of, patients develop tremor, cognitive dysfunction, inability to walk well, shuffling gait, etc. So they can be very impaired. Tends to affect folks later in life. There are advanced onset conditions, but tends to be a disease that affects the older population. So there have been some studies that have found protective effects, neuroprotective effects with infrared light, near infrared light. And dopaminergic, or neurons that secrete the hormone dopamine, are what is at the crux of the development of Parkinson's disease, because we're talking about loss of dopaminergic neurons. So interestingly, it seems like near infrared light may have some neuroprotective, again, not a great, I would say, greatly substantiated work, but there is some suggestion that that might be the case. There has also been some recent findings that have suggested that exposure to artificial light in bird and rodent models actually causes a loss of dopaminergic neurons. So again, that's interesting because these are the exact neurons that would be responsible for the development and progression of Parkinson's. So it seems that it's actually a direct effect, meaning it's not secondary to the circadian cycle, but instead the actual direct light source is causing this issue. Now that's interesting too, because if we're able to say, okay, we can better regulate circadian rhythms, we can help eliminate light at night, or take strides to do so, this would suggest that it's actually the light itself, even if it's emitted during the day, that may have a concern. So it's interesting because obviously this is animal data, it's not human data, but it makes us think that there may be a correlation here with an entirely different disease state that we had not necessarily thought through. A lot of attention has been paid to cancer, not as much to Parkinson's in terms of light pollution. So this is another study that looked at ischemia, and it's also different. So I thought it was interesting. This looked at a mouse model in particular. And so what happened was they actually had the mouse model had a cardiac arrest, induced cardiac arrest, went through resuscitation, and then they exposed that mouse model to, those mice, the subjects of the study, to dim light versus dark, no light. And the goal of this study was actually to look at recovery. So this wasn't a normal functioning mouse. This was a mouse who had experienced a cardiac arrest, who had been resuscitated, so had an injury. And the question was, how does this mouse recover from that injury when we manipulate the amount of light administered at night to that mouse while that mouse recovers. So again, two groups, either dim light or no light. And interestingly, the dim light group tended to have higher mortality rates following the cardiac arrest than the dark, not exposed to light group. Also, what was interesting was the primary neuronal damage. So the damage to the nerves themselves was greater in this group. So it wasn't just that, they had higher mortality. We don't really understand, why that correlates with function. No, we actually found that the neurons themselves tended to have more damage. So why would this be? Well, some of the markers that we're seeing, and again, the specifics aren't as interesting as I think the general trend, that it's almost the inflammatory markers that tended to be elevated. So pro-inflammatory cytokines, etc. Again, suggesting that the mechanism of damage was actually due to excess inflammation. So what's interesting is that the effects of light at night seem to be prevented by using a wavelength that was different. So using a different wavelength seemed to actually not have the same deleterious effects, but almost a protective effect, where the two groups were similar. What's interesting about this study in particular is it's looking at recovery and how light affects recovery. Now, this is obviously a mouse model, but I think what I found particularly interesting is when we think about hospitals and we think about what happens at night. No one can get a good night's sleep in a hospital. There's a lot of ambient light. There are monitors that use LED. There are folks waking you up to check on you. And if we can extrapolate from this data, again, it's a large extrapolation, but it's interesting. There's something about the recovery phase that needs to be kept pristine in order to, at least in this mouse model, provide for the best opportunity for recovery. And so to me, that's very compelling in terms of how we approach humans and recovery, because a lot of what we do at night influences what will happen to a person in the long term, but as a potential based on this data. So I'm just going to quickly go through this so we have time for Q&A. Light has been looked at as a form of therapy. So not only as a concern, but also as a form of therapy. So, there's been papers looking at blue light exposure. So for instance, let's say you are excessively sleepy. It may be a good thing to suppress your melatonin and increase your alertness. So in some pathologies, it's actually being looked at as a treatment. There are also issues related to mental illness. When some mental illnesses, it's thought to dysregulate sleep-wake, folks who have catatonic states, for instance, we're trying to understand what is the underpinning for these. But there is some thought that could we use blue light or some other form of light to actually treat these patients if we truly think it's a dysregulation that's happening. There's also a paper by Burgess that looked at fibromyalgia patients, so diffuse pain syndromes, and looking at light exposure in the mornings to see how that affected patients, and they tended to report improved function and pain sensitivity. So again, light can actually be restorative in certain situations. So I'm quickly going to go through this because, again, this is not the focus of the talk, but, thinking about animals, insects, when we talk about having a circadian pacemaker, for the most part, most creatures have some sort of form of understanding light or dark. Again, it may be more simplistic, but the nocturnists, the animals and insects that are awake and alert at night, do know it's night relative to day. So when that's disrupted by bright lights at night or even bright lights during the day in adjunct to the sunlight that they normally would perceive, this has been shown to have effects. So, looking at LED light traps, looking at the ways animals have changed their own behaviors, even in response to dim light, is an area of study that is ongoing. And ecosystems, I think, are interesting. You know, when we think about plants, plants respond to light. And so how does exposure at night or, you know, at times that don't make sense influence reproduction, influence, you know, the way plants actually behave, you know, how productive a plant may be. So I think these are areas as well that warrant additional study. And I think it's interesting because, again, it shows that we've adapted these universal mechanisms to understand day and night and have in turn entrained a lot of physiologic function from that. And so if we're able to do it, animals do it, insects do it, it certainly seems reasonable that plants would also do have similar functions. So what can be done? And again, the engineers in the group can speak to this much better than myself, but you know, some things that have been suggested: better shielding, use of different spectral intensities. Again, we have this general sense of blue light, but maybe within that spectrum, there are more safe forms versus not. Smart lighting at night, bright when you need it, out when you don't. Consumption in general of light sources and light. Sleep hygiene. So whenever I have a brain injured patient, I spent a fair amount of time counseling because I think sleep hygiene is so important. We all have a smartphone and we use it, you know, right before we go to bedtime, which is kind of the worst time to expose yourself to that light. And so I think establishing good habits in terms of not looking at a bright computer monitor or TV or phone right before bedtime may actually help us with those issues related to melatonin suppression, et cetera, and facilitate better sleep. Eye strain. Nowadays, you can buy glasses with blue light glare reduction. Anecdotally, I've had friends who use computers a lot and who feel like that's helped with headaches and things like that. No conclusive data, but I think certainly it's an interesting area of study. Now, lutein zeaxanthin has been studied in the context of macular degeneration. It's you know, it's a supplement that you can purchase. It's over the counter. There have been several studies looking at AREDS2, looking at its potentially protective role in development of macular degeneration. Now, I've talked to multiple folks, I've read the studies. Some people say, you know what, I take it every day. Other folks say, I don't think the data is solid enough, so I don't use it. So I would say it's still an area of interest. Certainly, I don't think there's a downside per se to taking it, but I can't say that it's conclusive in terms of its protective nature towards the progression of macular degeneration. So this is my Twitter handle and my email. Feel free to ask any questions, reach out to me. I'm going to talk through the chat now. Let me see here. Jen, would you like me to unshare my screen and go from there?
Thank you so much. Yes, if you're happy to unshare as you have, and I'm going to hand over to Gabby for questions. So everyone, please put your questions in the chat. And Maya, sorry to put you on the spot, but we've had a few people asking if you'd be willing to share your slides because there was so much great information in there. Is that possible?
Absolutely. Yep.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So we'll make sure we send that out to everybody who's here today. Okay, over to you, Gabby. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much, Dr. Babu, for that very informative presentation. While we're waiting for a few questions to come in, I might ask one that I've been sitting on for a while. I was sort of thinking about doing field work at uni, and when you're, out camping for multiple days, you can, tend to get in sync with, getting up when the sun rises, going to bed when it gets dark. So I was comparing going camping in summer versus winter, when you have much, longer days in summer and much shorter days in winter. So then you're getting more sleep in winter. Is there any merit to getting more sleep when the days are shorter? Should we be adjusting the amount of sleep we have depending on the amount of daylight we have?
Yeah, that's a great question. As far as I know, that hasn't been looked at as far as studied formally, but yeah, I mean, I think, probably the closest correlate is just, when we talk about seasonal affective disorder and, northern climates and exposure to sunlight and increased rates of, depression, binge drinking, all the things that, suggest some level of decreased desire or motivation to be outside of the home, or among other people. So I think that's an interesting thing to look at, is maybe if additional sleep hours were kind of almost prescribed, if that would help counteract some of those things. Not to my knowledge has that been studied. I think, unfortunately, sleep still is very much a black box, because even if, when we've tried to look at sleep, we've tried to look at it in terms of head injury. But it's hard in the sense that even if you look at a quote unquote normal patient population, there's the number of hours you sleep, but there's also the quality of sleep. So some of us don't need a lot of sleep, typically can get by on several hours, 4 or 5 hours. Others of us need 9 hours. And so then the question becomes, what about that sleep is different, and why is it more or just as restorative in one person than another, And I think we still don't understand, exactly what happens and why. It's not just the REM element. It's not just a certain aspect of the sleep cycle. It's almost all the person. There's a lot of individual variability. So I think getting back to what you're saying, it would be interesting to look at that and try to lengthen those periods of time in perhaps less light intense environments.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. It also sounded really interesting about light therapy. Are there any more examples that you could give us where this has been tested in places that, where seasonal affective disorder does occur? Has it been very successful?
Yeah, it can be, yes. So in some folks, this has been looked at, with depression in particular. But yes, seasonal affective disorder, it's been looked at. It has shown some promise for folks who, will have several hours of light. It's artificial light, but sometimes it's some amount of blue light, but often it's just a white light source, and it's 2 or 3 hours a day. And that can help tremendously from a mental health, pre and post testing. So yeah, that has been looked at. It's primarily a lot around mental health, not around other physiologic illnesses.
Sure, thank you. So we've got some questions coming in from our audience. I'll just read you the top one at this stage. So Kelly has asked, in the fluoroverse LED study, you described blue depleted light. Was that filtered LED?
I'd have to look back at that study, but I believe so.
Okay. Fantastic. So we have one from Marnie herself as well. Retimers were used by the Australian football team to try and put them back on track to the Australian circadian rhythm cycles during FIFA Cup finals. They travelled from Brazil to Australia and had matches 3 days apart in each country. This is a blue light machine. Do you think this could have benefits, or do you think this could have beneficial impacts or negative impacts?
That's interesting. Yeah, so it's interesting because, blue light seems to be suppressive across the board. I will say, some studies suggest it's not that suppressive of melatonin, but I would say by and large, blue light, the literature seems to suggest it has some effect on melatonin. It tends to suppress melatonin. So if that's the case, it could be used, especially if you're thinking of jet lag. You're trying to stay awake. So it certainly does seem to promote more alertness and awakeness. Could be pathologic depending on when they're exposed. But yeah, I mean, it certainly makes sense that it could be used to get them back on track, especially if there's significant changes with jet lag. Yeah, that's interesting.
Excellent. And we have one about supplements from Kevin. Can any correlations between vitamin D levels and melatonin production be considered in future studies of the effect of light on sleep pacemakers?
Yeah, so vitamin D, interestingly, doesn't seem to have any role. We talk about light exposure and promotion of vitamin D production, but interestingly, it doesn't seem to have a clear role, at least with the circadian pacemaker, which is interesting. So not to my awareness has it been looked at in particular. Now, melatonin production has, in terms of looking at external supplements of melatonin actually increasing their dose because they build a tolerance. So it does seem to have a ceiling in terms of the effect, which is interesting. But then also your body tends to produce some amount regardless, just, based on sleep-wake cycles, again, because that's the function of the pineal gland. So the question is, what kind of variability do individuals have in melatonin? And if you're not producing melatonin versus you are, does that actually lead to a functional change? Do those people not sleep? In other words, I think those sorts of studies, invasive studies, have not been performed. But I think that would be interesting to look at.
Yeah, fantastic. And we have a question on phosphobleaching. Given the huge investment, this is from Steve, given the huge investment of changing to LEDs, the issue of phosphobleaching is a real worry. There won't be much appetite to rechange all these lights. How well acknowledged is this phosphobleaching in the lighting industry, and how can we raise this with authorities?
Yeah, so I'm going to defer that to the lighting folks, if there are any on this call, because I know that there have been a tremendous number of advancements in lighting. And I should step back too. I know that, so what prompted all of this from the American Medical Association? I didn't delve into the report because of time, but I'm happy to. I know Marnie had brought that up as one of the questions, was some of the concern about the health effects related to light pollution. And it was unclear to us from a medical standpoint what this all meant. The studies out there, I would say there's a paucity of studies. There are not a lot of studies. They're not in depth. A lot of them use animal models, so we had to extrapolate. So when the report first came out, there was a tremendous amount of pushback from the lighting industry, because the lighting industry came back and said, look, we're doing all these things. We've advanced so far since the data you have was published, which is probably true. But unfortunately, because there's such a considerable lag, and now with COVID, there's even more of a lag in terms of data, not being generated. I think what we've experienced is that, we bring up what we have literature on, but it tends to be 10 years outdated. So not trying to sidestep your question, but my understanding is when I bring these issues up, a lot of folks in the lighting industry say, no, we're aware of this and we are doing X, Y, and Z to try to prevent this or decrease it. I guess my question is, that may be true of the light sources that are being developed, but what about what's already been installed? And so I don't have that information, because I agree with you. I mean, I think it's concerning if we're just, we understood that after the fact of the installation. What is the plan to address some of those issues? So that I don't know, but I do think a lot of the folks in the lighting industry seem open to the concerns. But I would agree with you, because I do think that there's just a lag between our awareness and what was installed, and I don't see a plan to undo a lot of that.
Yep. And we also have a question about lighting and memory. People may be working in the lighting industry, or in this case from Betty, talking about a friend who makes headlights. Have there been links with memory loss issues in studies that you've seen?
Yeah, that's interesting. No, none of the studies that I've looked at have actually looked at memory in particular. Memory is hard to study. I mean, there's a battery of tests that can be looked at, but that would be certainly, I think, interesting, getting back to the quality of sleep issue. Yeah.
And we have another one from Marnie. What can Australia learn from the AMA report on blue light? What steps should we take to introduce this sort of research and understanding to our medical practitioners and decision makers? I believe you were involved in the AMA report yourself. Yeah.
Yes, yep, exactly. And yeah, so the American Medical Association report first came out, I want to say in 2016, I believe, 2016, and it's in the fuller presentation, so I can send that out with the slides. But, like I said, the interesting thing was it was probably our most, looked up thing on the website that we've ever had to date, because I think when it came out, again, there was so much controversy around it, because the specific lighting frequencies that were described were the ones we had the literature on. So there was a lot of pushback from industry in terms of, well, that's not up to date and all these things. But, I think what I would say is this. I mean, I think it's better to have attention paid now especially as the installation has happened or is happening, because there's going to be a lag. We assume that there's going to be a lag between our awareness and what's already been done or has happened. And so the more attention we can bring to actually raising these concerns, the better. And I think, one thing that's very promising is now you look for glasses. I mean, a lot of times you can add on blue light glare protection. We weren't thinking about blue light just a few years ago, but now it's become almost a commonplace. Like, can you add that to my glasses? The fact that even lay people are sort of aware that there's something not right about blue light, potentially it's concern. I think that type of awareness is going to be helpful as we continue studying it moving forward. So, I mean, I think the Australian Medical Association, any and all attention that can be paid, even if it's a rudimentary study to this topic, I think is very helpful.
Okay, fantastic. We have another one from Stefan regarding outdoor lighting applications. So the current trend is to move towards these warmer CCT lighting and reducing our blue light content. Considering the circadian rhythms with these color changing lights, should we be having cooler lights in the morning and then adjusting to warmer lights in the afternoon, or would it be more beneficial to get natural light during the day?
Yeah, that in particular hasn't been looked at, but I think, yes, it seems that natural lighting sources are the control group, and they don't tend to have the same negative effects as the artificial light does, whether it's fluorescence or another source. But it does seem that, yes, warmer color lights tend to be is more protective. Again, it hasn't been studied per se head to head, but I think that there's enough literature on that. And did you want me to answer the question about bedside lamps too, or the statement?
Sure, that would be great. Someone made a comment that we shouldn't have LED lights for our bedside lamps before bed. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's reasonable. It is ironic because you're told to, just watch TV before you go to bed, or, just read before you go to bed. That'll help you sleep. And I mean, my area of interest is sleep and traumatic brain injury. And, for those folks, that's almost the worst thing. And really for any one of us, I should say, just having a really bright source right before you're trying to go to sleep is not, we're learning is actually not helpful. So your body has to be much more tired before you can reach a point where you fall asleep well. So yeah, I mean, I think the more we understand, the more we can probably tailor lighting sources to the times and the functions that are appropriate. And then I think a better understanding of just don't look at your phone, don't look at your computer screen, your TV before bed, at least an hour, hour and a half before, I think is just in general good advice. I think those were all the questions. I don't know about the recording available to all participants.
I've just sent a message to ask Marnie about the recording because I'm afraid I'm not sure either. If she gets back to me in the next little while, I shall let everybody know.
Okay, perfect. She just texted me.
Alrighty, we're having a lot of very kind words coming through in the chat for you as well, Dr. Babu. So thank you again for your presentation today.
Absolutely. Yep. And just let me know if there are any other questions or anything else.
While we're giving people another moment to put in their questions, I just wanted to quickly say that ADSA has been working on a really exciting project at the moment, looking at the potential of developing a dark sky network. They've sort of paired up with DOR, the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment. And they've recently released a survey as a part of this. And Jen will include a link to that so you can hop on and look at it yourself. But we're interested in getting people's opinions and experiences with dark sky conservation here in Australia. There are 3 different surveys, one for the general public who are interested in dark sky conservation, 2 for members of local councils, and the 3rd one are for people who have been involved in existing dark sky places. And these surveys will be open until Monday, the 28th of February. So there's still plenty of time to get in your results, and we'd really appreciate that.
And if I could just mention too, I actually just had got a response from someone in the lighting industry. So I guess there's been movement towards understanding the differences between spherical and flat surface light emitters and how that may also change how light from LED sources can be made safer. So it seems like there's a lot of work happening, kind of to get back to that earlier question of what can we do to raise awareness with industry. So yeah, that I think that's an evolving an area as well.
It looks like we have another question from Steve. The delay onset of melatonin after exposure to light, is this related to natural dusk? You mentioned an hour to hour and an hour half bright sources.
Yes, so assuming no light sources at all, it's typically related to darkness for a period of time. So after sunset and after it's dark, probably an hour and a half. So to mimic that, probably the best thing, because now we have just so much light at night, is to try to stay off of all of our devices for at least an hour and a half before sleep, which I think is very challenging. It's easy to say, but it's very challenging. But yes, that hasn't been studied formally in terms of looking specifically at hormonal levels to see if there's a trend or a change, I should say. But it seems kind of based on what we observe that it's probably related.
I have one more quick question before we wrap things up. I saw you mention night shift workers and some of the studies that might have suggested, a correlation between these workers and certain cancers and other conditions. If that does turn out to be the case, will there be, what can be done? Should there be some sort of compensation then for people who have to work night shifts, given these health complications that might arise because of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what we've seen is, so a couple of things. One, the question is, if there is this consistent effect, can the night shift be switched? Is there a benefit to having some folks who work nights one week, work days the next week? Does that help alter or reduce your risk if the risk is there? That's one question. A second question is, what can be done over the night shift to promote health behaviors? Because a lot of times, the question is too partially, is it self-selected? Like, so for instance, if you choose, night shift, it may mean that you're looking for, less activity because it is night. It tends to be a slower pace depending on obviously the job. But, I'm thinking more if you're an aide or something, you're helping another person, you're a nursing aide, et cetera. It tends to be quieter at night. So that may be something that's self-selected, that you want that sort of less high impact than during the day. So if that's the case, what can we do to encourage, walking breaks, health behaviors at night, healthier foods that are available in the cafeteria, tends to just have snack food available, things like that. To promote more health behaviors, because I think a lot of like the diabetes, the overweight is related to a lot of those behaviors. So it may just be not having access to healthier options, on the off hours. And then I think too, looking at the light sources internally, what are we using, and is there a way, if it's exposure to light and the type of light, if we're able to maybe alter that, will that help us undo some of these effects? I mean, I think that's an interesting question as well.
Thank you. We'll just have one more question before we wrap up. Where there was a question from Joe regarding, have any of these studies been done on children? Would these same recommendations for 1 and 1.5 hours of not using your phone before bed be the same for kids, or would that be different?
I'm not aware of any studies in children in particular. I mean, there have been some observational studies looking at like tablets in children. Similar, I think it was more looking at the cognitive concerns, cognitive function instead of sleep per se. But I would say, yes, in general, we tend to lengthen the time off of these devices for children. So longer than hour and a half is probably safer. But, children are now increasingly using tablets a lot and sleeping with them under their beds, and that can cause other issues. So yeah, that's an area of, I would say, ongoing research.
Much easier said than done. Same with, using our own devices before bed. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've had a lot of interest in whether you would be comfortable sharing the recording so people can view this again. Are you happy to do so?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And lastly, I just want to mention our next webinar is on Thursday, the 21st of April, and we'll be looking at protecting New Zealand's dark skies. So please hop on ADSA's website. Jen's just provided the link, and we'll see you all then. Thank you again for joining us today, Dr. Babu, and thank you everyone for coming along and sharing your questions.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.